The trouble started in the winter of 1841, but the mistakes that led to it were made long before the snow began to fall, before the hard frost settled into the bones of the Wyoming Territory, before wind screamed through the ravines like a wounded animal, before roofs began to collapse and men started digging themselves out with frozen fingers. Long before that, they laughed. They laughed when the boys started hauling willow saplings into the valley. They laughed when he lashed the branches together with rawhide, when he packed moss and mud into tiny gaps like a child building a nest. They called it a playhouse, a hovel, a joke. Some of them chuckled behind their hands. Others didn't bother hiding it. "That ain't a cabin," one settler spat. "That's a basket turned upside down." The name stuck. Basket House. The boy heard it every day, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with venom, sometimes with pity, which was the worst of all. His name was Ezra Dalton, 19 years old, slim-built, dark-haired, quiet, born in Ohio, traveled west with his uncle's wagon train after his father died of lung fever. He wasn't a trapper, wasn't a rancher, wasn't much of anything yet. He didn't drink or fight or boast like the others, and he didn't follow their ways of building either. When the families who came into the valley that spring split up the land and began raising their cabins, Ezra didn't pick the flat spot near the river like everyone else. He chose the bend in the valley where the hills rose behind him in a crescent, forming a natural break against the wind. He watched the sun and picked the slope that caught morning light and lost the western glare by dusk. He studied the ground until he found the driest soil, the place where snowmelt wouldn't pool and summer rains wouldn't rot out the base of his home. But it was the structure itself that drew ridicule. The settlers came west with a common knowledge. Cabins were to be built one way: large logs, square-notched corners, one room if you were alone, maybe two if you had a family, a stone fireplace on the north side, shingle or sod roof, simple, strong, traditional. That was the way it was done. Ezra did none of it. He didn't cut big logs, he didn't notch anything, he didn't even use nails. Instead, he wove. He took green willows and bent them into arches, fixing their ends into holes he'd dug in the earth. He crossed them with more saplings, lashed tight with hide and cord and dried vine. He packed the frame with mud and grass and pine needles, layering it thick over a skin of bark and woven mats. He used charcoal, mixed into the outer coat of plaster, to weatherproof it. He left no straight lines, no square corners, no sharp edges. From a distance, it looked like a mound or a rounded thicket, something organic and wild, not the work of a civilized hand. They called it primitive. They called it ugly, but Ezra called it home. He never explained himself, not fully, but there was a story he told once to a widow named Margaret who lived 2 cabins over and treated him like a nephew. When she asked why he'd built it that way, why not use the tall pine that grew in plenty near the ridge, he'd said something soft, almost embarrassed. "My mother was Cherokee," he said. "She told me stories of winter homes made of earth and willow, homes that breathed and held warmth. She said a good house lets you sleep even when the wind howls outside." Margaret didn't laugh. She just nodded and brought him a jar of pickled carrots that evening, and he fixed her cabin door when the hinges came loose in October. The others didn't ask. They didn't care. Ezra had built his basket house, and the valley had moved on. By November, snow fell heavy and fast. The first storm came earlier than expected, driven down from the mountains in a blue wave that slammed the settlement with ice-laden wind. Fires struggled to keep pace with the cold. Chimneys drew poorly. Some cabins smoked so bad inside that the men coughed themselves raw, and their children woke wheezing. Logs shrank with the cold. Gaps opened between walls. Chinking crumbled. The women stuffed rags in holes and clay into the corners. Men added blankets to the walls. They burned wood faster than they could cut it. By Christmas, half the valley had frostbite on their fingers. Ezra's cabin stayed warm. No one believed it at first. They assumed he was lying, that he had a fire roaring day and night. But Margaret came to visit one afternoon in January, wrapped in a buffalo hide and shivering like a leaf. When Ezra opened the door, a rush of warm air hit her face like bread from a summer oven. She stepped inside and stopped cold. There was no smoke, no biting chill. The fire was nothing more than glowing coals, a kettle steaming gently on a low stone ring. The walls curved gently overhead, thick and dark and warm. It felt like being wrapped in a fur coat. Margaret sat in stunned silence while Ezra poured her tea. Outside, the wind screamed through the gaps in other cabins, rattling shutters and throwing snow against the logs. Inside the basket house, there was peace. That winter broke records. By February, the valley had lost 3 cabins to collapse, 1 under snow load, 2 more from roof leaks that froze and split the beams. A child died in one. A woman lost her toes in another. They started talking about leaving, heading east again, waiting out the season in Fort Laramie or even Cheyenne. Horses died. Axes broke from overuse. Fires ran low. rations thinned. Ezra kept to himself, but they started noticing, started watching, started whispering. They'd mocked his childlike house, his round-walled burrow, his willow-woven dome. Now they looked at it differently. It didn't lose heat. It didn't leak. The roof was curved and slick, and the snow slid off instead of piling up. The wind passed over it like water over stone. And when the worst storm came in late February, the one that tore the roof off the Anders house and buried the Hanley cabin in 5 feet of drift, Ezra's home stayed dry and solid. When they came to him, cold, desperate, broken by weeks of suffering, they didn't speak of pride. They asked questions. How did he build it? Could he show them? Could he help? Ezra didn't gloat, didn't remind them of their laughter. He didn't ask for coin or favors. He simply nodded and told them where to cut willow, which mud packed best, how to shape the arch of the roof so the load would never press too hard in one place. By the time spring thaw came, a third of the cabins in the valley had been patched with Ezra's techniques. 2 were torn down completely and rebuilt using his methods. And yet the story doesn't end there, because what Ezra knew, what he learned from both blood and experience, went deeper than willow frames and curved walls. What he knew was that survival in the high country wasn't about appearances. It wasn't about pride. It was about harmony, about working with nature instead of against it, about humility in the face of wind and frost and time. That spring, settlers returned to their routines. They planted, they hunted, they cut logs and mended fences, but something had changed. The valley had seen what endurance looked like, not in the tallest house, not in the thickest walls, but in the strange little structure they once called a basket. They stopped calling it that. They started calling it the warm house. And when the next winter came and brought with it a different kind of storm, one that tested not just buildings but hearts, Ezra's lessons would matter more than ever. Because survival isn't always about the body. Sometimes it's about the soul. And the next challenge would test both. Spring arrived slow and sullen that year. The thaw didn't come with songbirds or blooming grass, but with a groaning, wet rot that crept down the mountains and into the valley floor. Ice cracked in the river like bones breaking under strain. The settlers, haggard from the worst winter in memory, emerged one by one from their battered cabins, blinking against pale sunlight, gaunt and changed. They did not celebrate the thaw, they only endured it. Survival had become a quieter thing, less boastful, more sacred. The homes that hadn't collapsed bore their scars. Rooflines sagged, chinking peeled from log seams like old scabs. Fireplaces crumbled, doors warped. Men walked with limps they hadn't had before the snows came. Children coughed deep in their chests. There was more silence in the valley now, fewer arguments, fewer boasts shouted across the meadows. It was as if winter had taken more than wood and blood. It had taken the settlers' confidence. Except for Ezra, the young man's house stood unchanged, still smooth, still solid, still warm. He emerged from it not pale or broken, but strong and quiet-eyed, like someone who had not merely survived the trial but absorbed it, learned from it, carried something forward. The settlers noticed. They watched him differently now, not with ridicule, but with cautious respect. Some of them copied his design, building partial domes or adding curved outbuildings that caught less wind. Others borrowed pieces, roofing methods, mud layering, the willow frame approach, but none of them understood the soul of the structure. They saw the result, but not the reason, and that would matter more than they realized. By late April, the valley buzzed with labor again. Fields were turned over, fences repaired, horses reshod, tools sharpened, but an undercurrent moved beneath the surface, something harder to name. It began with a man named Thomas Becket. Becket was from Missouri, tall and broad-shouldered with thick forearms and a voice like splitting wood. He had arrived with the wagon train 2 years earlier, claiming a wide patch of land at the northern end of the valley. He was a builder by trade, or so he said, and had led the initial construction efforts when the settlement began. His cabin had been the largest, the proudest, the one with a second floor and glass windows, shipped at great expense. He had mocked Ezra's basket house the loudest, even offered to build the boy a real shelter before a stiff breeze knocked his twigs over. But Beckett's home had nearly caved in that winter. The fancy beams had split under snow load. The shingles had peeled. One of the windows shattered during a February wind shear. He and his wife had spent the final month of winter sleeping in their root cellar, huddled under bare hides. When the thaw came, Beckett didn't just emerge bruised. He emerged furious. It wasn't just shame. It wasn't just the collapse of his pride. It was the shift in leadership. People no longer looked to him for advice. They looked to Ezra. When the Anders family asked for help rebuilding their corner joints, they asked Ezra. When the Moors needed guidance on how to pack moss between new logs, they asked Ezra. When even Reverend Stiles wanted to discuss altering the church's meeting hall to reduce wind load, he asked Ezra. That galled Beckett like a rusted nail under the skin. He began muttering, quiet at first, words planted like seeds. He's just lucky. That house of his? Looks like something an animal would crawl into. Who knows what he's doing in there? Sleeping warm, sure, but alone? Don't forget his mother was an Indian, and that was the crack. The one Beckett pried open with the edge of his voice, the side glances, the heavy words dropped like stones in still water. The settlers didn't say much out loud, not at first. They owed Ezra their warmth, their safety, some of them their lives. But fear and pride are strong. And when spring storms began to rise again, when one new cabin wall collapsed in a sudden wind, and another fire smoked so badly a child nearly suffocated, Beckett's voice got louder. He didn't call it jealousy. He called it tradition. We've been building cabins a certain way since Jamestown, he said during a meeting by the riverbank. There's wisdom in that, strength in that. Ezra's ways are foreign. They may work now. But what happens in 5 years? In 10? You want your children raised in dirt huts? Ezra was not present at that meeting. He was helping Margaret, the widow, reinforce her pantry wall against spring melt. The settlers didn't vote, didn't declare anything formal. But slowly their backs began to turn. Offers of help dried up. Neighbors stopped waving in the mornings. Questions stopped coming. Ezra noticed, but he said nothing. He had grown up quiet. He knew the cold. In early May, 2 boys went missing. Brothers, aged 7 and 9. They'd gone out chasing frogs along the creek after supper and never returned. A search party formed. The valley fanned out with lanterns and dogs, calling names into darkness. They found the boys the next morning curled against the base of a tree 3 miles upstream. One of them had twisted his ankle on a root. The other stayed with him through the night. They were cold but alive, because Ezra had found them first. He had tracked their footprints through the river mud, read the bent grass, spotted the spot where a boot had slipped. He'd reached them hours before the others, and built a fire from dry bark and pine needles, fed them pine tea from a leather pouch he carried, wrapped them in his own coat. When the searchers arrived, the boys were asleep beside warm embers. No one said thank you, not directly. But the eyes of the mothers in the valley softened. For a week, then Beckett's wife began whispering again. Why was he alone in the woods at night? She asked. Why does he know how to track so well? His mother, remember? Maybe he's more savage than we thought. No one confronted Ezra, but fewer people met his eyes. The help requests stopped entirely. The homes being rebuilt now followed Beckett's methods again. Straight walls, peaked roofs, stone chimneys on the northern side. The old ways, the real ways. Ezra kept to himself, but Margaret didn't. When she brought Ezra a new batch of dried apples, she asked him if he was all right. He smiled and said he was. She didn't believe him. That night, someone threw a stone at her cabin window. It cracked the glass. Things had turned. By June, it became clear there was a plan. Beckett and 3 other men, Rogers, Halpin, and Judd, were coordinating something. Materials were being pooled. A meeting house was being expanded. And most telling of all, they were buying up all the willow from the creek banks, the exact materials Ezra had been using to help others. Someone asked about it once, and Rogers laughed. We're building a bathhouse, he said. Can't a man wash? It was a lie. They were trying to erase Ezra's method by imitating it poorly and claiming it as their own. Then came the fire. One evening, in late June, a blaze broke out in the lean-to barn behind Margaret's cabin. The hay went up first. Dry from the sun, the flames licked the side of her house in seconds. She screamed, and neighbors came running. Ezra arrived first, throwing buckets, beating the flames with wet blankets, dragging Margaret out from the smoke. Together, they managed to contain it before the main structure burned. The next morning, black smudges marked her walls. Someone had poured lamp oil under the hay. No one was arrested. Beckett's voice grew bolder in the days that followed. These new structures, unnatural things, invite rot, invite danger. They change the valley. They change our ways. They change our people. Ezra said nothing. But in the quiet of those nights, he added something new to his basket house. A second door, hidden under brush, opening toward the hills. Not because he feared confrontation, but because the land had taught him, if the wind shifts, so must you. But the next test would come not from Beckett's schemes or the settlers' suspicions. It would come from the sky, because the valley, already wounded, was about to face a storm no structure was built for. No structure, except one. The air changed before the storm arrived. Not in temperature, not in smell, but in weight. A heaviness hung over the valley, like wet wool laid across the chest. Birds went silent. Insects disappeared. Even the dogs stopped barking. Ezra noticed it first, because he was always listening. He watched the clouds mass in the west, low, dark, and rolling, not the gentle curls of spring weather, but dense bodies of thunderhead bruising into the horizon like waves of lead. It had been an unusually hot week for June, days brushing 90, nights thick with humidity. The land had cracked in places, the grass yellowed early, and yet the river still ran high from snowmelt. It was a dangerous balance. Dry surface, saturated soil, overfilled creeks. Ezra saw it in the way the willows leaned, and how the frogs fell silent 2 nights before the first lightning strike. On the 3rd day of that pressure, the storm came. It didn't begin with rain. It began with wind, violent and erratic, blowing from all directions at once. It tore shingles loose from Beckett's rebuilt roof. It flung a wagon upright against the side of the Judd cabin. A chicken coop skidded 50 feet across packed dirt and shattered like tinder. Then the lightning followed. Forks of white fire laced the sky, so bright they turned night to a frozen blue. Thunder boomed, not in peals, but in constant rolling tremors that shook dishes from shelves and rattled the teeth in every settler's skull. And then the rain fell. It fell not in drops but in sheets, a solid wall of water dumped from the sky without warning or restraint. In 10 minutes the ground turned to soup. In 30 the creek jumped its banks. By midnight the valley was a basin, a low bowl of rising water with nowhere to go. The settlers weren't ready. They had built too low, too flat, too close to the river for easy access to water and trade. Ezra had not. He had built his home into the bend of a hill, just above the natural floodline, something no one had even considered when choosing plots the previous spring. They had laughed, called him impractical for being so far from the water, for needing to carry his buckets half a mile each day. Now that hill saved him. He heard it before he saw it, a roar, low and deep, like an avalanche made of mud. When he stepped outside, rain blinding his vision, he saw it coming, a black surge of water, thick with trees, debris, fence posts, animals and shattered tools. The flood moved like a hand sweeping across the valley, erasing everything not nailed down or rooted deep. Cabins near the river vanished in seconds. Lanterns disappeared in the blink of an eye. Screams rose, thin, ragged, short-lived, and then silence took their place. Ezra moved. He'd already packed a bundle earlier in the day, something instinct told him to do. Inside it were dried meat, a coil of rope, a skin of pine tea, his hunting knife, flint, and a length of canvas. He slung it over his shoulder and stepped into the storm. The water was halfway up Margaret's porch when he reached her. The old woman was dragging sacks of dried corn to higher ground, her dress soaked and dragging like lead. Ezra didn't hesitate. He lifted her over his shoulder, lashed the sack to her waist with cord, and carried her uphill through water that clutched at his knees, then his hips, then nearly his chest. When they reached his cabin, she collapsed inside, coughing, eyes wide and stunned. But he didn't stop. 3 more times he went back out, each time deeper into the flood, each time pulling someone else behind him. The Baird child, separated from her parents and clinging to the branch of a broken apple tree. The Halpin twins, who had been trapped in their cabin until the roof caved in and water poured through like a broken barrel. And lastly, Beckett's wife, stumbling along the ridge after being swept nearly 100 yards downstream. He found her clawing at the mud, one leg clearly broken, sobbing as the water lapped at her hips. He didn't ask her anything. He just picked her up and carried her home. By dawn, the valley had been transformed. What once had been a scattered grid of cabins and gardens and split-rail fences was now a swamp of broken lumber and sodden belongings. The church lay in splinters. The Anders barn floated upside down in a distant tree line. Beckett's proud 2-story home was gone, reduced to fragments scattered over several acres, its glass windows shattered and half buried in mud. But Ezra's cabin stood. The rounded walls deflected the wind. The curved roof shed water. The willow frame flexed instead of breaking. Inside, 12 people huddled dry and warm, listening to the rain fade into silence as the storm passed. Not one of them said a word for a long time. When they finally did, it was Margaret who broke the silence. "I think we owe him our lives." No one disagreed. Beckett's wife wept quietly in the corner, her hands shaking. The Halpin twins held each other without speaking. Ezra sat near the hearth, stoking coals and boiling water for tea, his eyes distant. He said nothing. He didn't want thanks. He didn't need it. But something had shifted. When the waters receded 3 days later, what remained of the settlement was unrecognizable. Half the population was gone, some dead, others scattered into the hills, walking eastward in search of shelter and salvation. The survivors gathered near Ezra's cabin, the only standing structure in a 2-mile radius. They looked to him now, not as a curiosity or a mistake, but as the man who had seen the storm coming before anyone else had understood the clouds. He didn't gloat. He walked them through the wreckage, pointed to the high ground, showed them the safe zones. He marked flood lines with ash on stones. He drew out new patterns for building, based not on symmetry or tradition, but on the movements of wind and water and fire. He taught without raising his voice, and then, when the first family rebuilt their shelter in Ezra's style, rounded, sun-aligned, raised on stone, willows woven tight with bark mats, others followed. Even Beckett, when he returned a week later, bruised and sunburned from his trek toward Cheyenne, he didn't carry his old swagger. His beard was overgrown, his clothes torn, and his eyes hollow. He didn't speak when he saw Ezra, just nodded, then began hauling stone for the foundation of a new cabin, on higher ground. The valley changed that summer. No one called it the basket house anymore. They called it the Stone Eye, because the way it sat in the bend of the hill made it look like something watching over them, enduring. And slowly Ezra became the center, not because he sought power, but because he had proven that listening to the land was stronger than tradition. That shape mattered more than pride. That silence could teach more than boasting ever had. Children began studying how he packed mud. Women learned how to tie willow the way he did. Men started shaping their roofs to curve like the slope of the wind. And bit by bit, a new kind of settlement grew, one not built on the rigidity of imported wisdom, but on the bending, breathing resilience of a people learning to live with the land instead of against it. But the final test hadn't come yet, because nature tests in cycles, and men are slower learners than the storm. The next trial would not be wind nor flood, but fire, and only the homes that understood heat and breath and air would survive. They thought they had suffered the worst nature had to offer. The storm had taken half their homes, the flood had nearly taken their lives, and in the fragile weeks that followed, they clung to each other like driftwood in a wide, an unforgiving sea. They gathered around Ezra's designs. They rebuilt, not just homes, but a way of thinking, one shaped less by pride and more by humility, less by the wisdom of the East and more by the patience of the land itself. Willow structures rose on higher ground, curved roofs dotted the ridgeline, and people began whispering, not of fear, but of hope. Then came the drought. It started subtly, a mist rain here, a drying stream there, but within a month, the river shrank to a trickle, the meadows yellowed, the corn curled, and what little game remained moved higher into the mountains. By July, the valley was dry as bone, and the sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, day after day without reprieve. Ezra felt it in his lungs, in the tightness of the air, in the way pine needles cracked underfoot instead of springing back. He watched how the grass turned from green to gray, then vanished altogether. He watched dust cling to every surface, and he began preparing, not for thirst, but for fire. The first flame sparked on the northern ridge in late July. A careless spark maybe, a dropped coal. No one ever learned for sure. But by the time anyone saw the smoke, the slope was already ablaze. It moved faster than they thought possible. Fed by wind and fuel-starved trees, the fire leapt from one stand of brush to another, dancing down the hillside with a hunger that only the driest summer could inspire. The settlers barely had time to organize. The ones closest to the blaze fled with only the clothes on their backs. Horses bucked, chickens scattered. The Anders boy ran through the woods, screaming for his dog. The fire hit the valley like a red tide. Everything they'd rebuilt was suddenly in danger again, not from water this time, but from heat, from smoke, from the kind of elemental fury that doesn't negotiate. Homes burned in minutes. Some exploded with the collapse of makeshift chimneys and overheated stoves. The wind turned the smoke into a wall. Vision dropped to nothing. Ash rained from the sky like snow in reverse. But in the center of the inferno, Ezra's cabin stood. It wasn't fireproof, no home truly was, but the way it had been built, the earthen outer shell, the damp-packed moss, the layers of bark and mud and stone, made it resist the flame in a way no log structure could. Where pine logs caught like matchsticks, Ezra's willow ribs smoldered slowly. Where roof shingles curled and fell in burning pieces, Ezra's curved dome let embers slide away. And most importantly, the area around his cabin had been cleared down to packed soil. He'd kept no firewood stacked against the walls, no dry thatch near the edges. He had known what might come, even when no one else had. So he opened his doors again. This time, not just to 12 people. This time, to over 30. They poured into his home like refugees into a church. Women with crying infants, men with soot-blackened hands and raw throats, children coughing until they collapsed. Ezra led them inside, closed the door, and packed the seams with wet cloth. He ladled out pine tea and dampened blankets. He told them to lie low, to breathe shallow, to stay calm. And when the fire reached his hilltop, when it surrounded his home on all sides and filled the air with heat like a blacksmith's forge, they waited, and the house held. It smoldered, it smoked, the outer layer blistered, but the structure did not burn. Ezra had used clay mixed with ash and lime on the outer shell, a technique he'd learned from a French trapper who once spoke of Roman fireproofing methods. The mix hardened in heat, the curved roof diverted flame, the small windows were sealed with stone slabs, designed not for looks, but for resilience. The entire structure functioned less like a house and more like a sealed vessel, a kiln that baked rather than burned. Outside, the fire moved on. It passed like a judgment. By morning, most of the valley lay in cinders. What the flood had spared, the fire devoured. Outbuildings gone, fences charred to black stubs, wells choked with ash. The church, rebuilt in traditional style just 2 months before, had been reduced to scorched earth. Even the meeting house that Beckett and the others had claimed would be a symbol of true settler strength had collapsed in on itself during the night. Only Ezra's home remained, a little blackened, yes, but standing. When they stepped outside that morning, blinking through the smoky dawn, they saw it clearly, what had been proven, not once, not twice, but now a third time. His childish cabin had outlasted wind, water, and now fire, not because it was magic, not because of luck, but because it had been built with the land, not on it, with the knowledge of sun and slope and airflow, with humility, not hubris, with care, not convention. No one laughed anymore. Some wept, some knelt and prayed. Beckett walked up the hill at midday, limping from a burn on his thigh, smoke still clinging to his beard. He stood outside Ezra's cabin, hat in hand, eyes hollow. "I was wrong," he said. "I mocked what I didn't understand." Ezra nodded. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't want it. The land didn't care who was sorry. It only cared who learned. That night the survivors held council, not in a building, not with speeches. They gathered on the hillside, sitting in the ash, watching the sky turn from grey to gold, and they asked Ezra to speak. He didn't preach, he didn't scold, he simply laid out a plan, how to rebuild using materials that resisted fire, how to space buildings to reduce risk, how to create fire breaks in the brush, how to orient entrances to minimize wind-fueled flare-ups, how to bury ember traps beneath stone. And then he said something else. "We can't keep building as if we're still back east," he said. "This land has different rules. It punishes pride and rewards listening. If we don't listen, we'll keep losing everything." No one argued. And so, for the third time in 2 seasons, the valley began again. But this time, it was different. This time, Ezra wasn't the outlier. He was the blueprint. Cabins took on curved lines. Fire breaks were cleared wide and deep. Roofs were sealed with layered earth and bark, not shingles. Chimneys were set away from sleeping spaces, built with breathing channels and air traps that drew heat safely. Families shared walls between structures to conserve warmth. Root cellars doubled as storm shelters. Gardens were planted higher, away from water lines. Wells were dug deeper. And Ezra, once a boy mocked for weaving twigs, became not a builder, not a teacher, but something closer to a keeper of memory. A man who had preserved more than lives. He had preserved sense. He had taught them how to live in a place that did not care for pride or tradition. He did not call it wisdom. He called it adaptation. And still the land had more to say, because the final storm had not yet come. Not of wind, or fire, or flood, but of man. And that storm would be the hardest of all to survive. By the end of that summer, the valley was not the same place it had been the year before. The flood had carved new channels through the meadows, erasing paths the settlers once knew by heart. The wildfire had blackened the ridgelines, scorching trees that had stood for a century. Where proud, square-cornered cabins once dotted the basin, only scorched stumps and splintered remnants remained, except for the homes rebuilt in Ezra's style. Those stood like stones in a dried riverbed, scarred perhaps, but whole. In this quiet aftermath, the survivors grew close. They were few now, 15 families maybe from the original 40 that had set out with wagons full of ambition and Eastern ideas. Those who remained had buried the old ways out of necessity. They followed Ezra not because he demanded it, but because he understood things they had once ignored. His voice had never risen, but it had carried. His warnings had been soft, but they had come true. His childish shelter had proven the only sanctuary that could stand against everything nature had thrown at them. And so they built their homes like his, curved, low to the ground, packed with layers of earth and ash and bark, windows small, roofs sealed, structures designed not for pride but for permanence. The valley began to breathe again. Babies were born that fall. Corn sprouted late but strong. The settlers gathered under the stars to sing again. Firelight flickered on soot-streaked faces, now etched with deeper lines, but also a kind of peace. They had survived. Then came the men with papers. They arrived in September, 3 of them, on horseback, clean coats and pressed boots, too polished for travel, too relaxed for men who understood the wilderness. They bore no scars from storms, no burns from fire, no thick hands worn by axes. They rode in slow, eyes scanning the land like it was already theirs. They called themselves representatives. Of what exactly they did not say at first, only that they came from Cheyenne, that they worked for the company, that they had maps, claims, surveys, that they wished to speak with the property holders. They carried ledgers, seals, inkpots with silver-capped lids. The settlers, uncertain but polite, gathered near Ezra's cabin where the open land allowed the crowd to stand in view of one another. The men introduced themselves, Wendell, Bishop, and Trask. They set up a table, unfolded a rolled map across it, and began speaking in tones of practiced confidence. They said the land had value, that minerals had been detected in the mountains to the west, silver, possibly copper, that a road would be coming through in the next 2 years, linking the territory with the railroad, that now was the time to capitalize. They used the word often, capitalize. They said they'd been authorized to purchase land deeds. That cash could be exchanged on the spot for signatures. That relocation assistance was available. That new lands farther east were better suited for settlers. That the valley was destined to become something greater than a backwoods refuge. They smiled when they said it, as if the offer was a gift. No one moved. Bishop leaned forward. "We can pay $20 per acre," he said, "and that's generous." Still, no one moved. Ezra stepped forward at last. "There are no deeds here," he said, "only homes." Wendell, the oldest of the three, offered a small, patient smile. "That's precisely why we're here, to offer you formal ownership, legal recognition, but that means making way for development." He paused, then added, "Progress, Mr. Dalton. You understand?" Ezra looked at the map. It didn't show the fire-scarred ridges. It didn't mark the floodplain. It didn't indicate the willow stands or the spring that fed the east-facing gardens. It was all flat ink and straight lines, drawn by someone who had never stepped on this ground. The map had no memory. "No," Ezra said, "you don't understand. This place isn't made for straight lines." That night, the valley split. Some settlers, worn down by a year of disaster and hard living, whispered in corners. $20 an acre was more than most of them had ever seen. A family with 10 acres could leave with a fortune. They could start over in a town, sleep under slate roofs, send their children to schools with books and bell towers. The offer was tempting. Others stood behind Ezra. Margaret, now nearly 70, stood before the fire that night and said, "I've already buried one son in this soil. I won't let his resting place be bought like cattle." Her voice didn't shake, but Beckett hesitated. He had rebuilt a home like Ezra's. He had apologized, followed, learned. But when Trask placed a bag of coin in front of him and said, "Think of your children," Beckett didn't answer. He looked away. By the week's end, 5 families had signed. They packed wagons and loaded what little they could. They said goodbye with downcast eyes. The others watched them leave with a mix of sorrow and resentment. The valley felt smaller in their absence, empty in a new way. The 3 men stayed. They set up a tent at the edge of the meadow, began measuring with strange tools, drove stakes into the earth, drew lines in chalk and string, and each day they tried again. They targeted the uncertain. They offered more money. They hinted at consequences. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of a land dispute," Bishop said one afternoon to the Moors. "Once the government gets involved, things get complicated. Best to settle it now," Ezra warned them. "These men don't see a valley, they see a ledger. But fear works fast when trust is fragile." 2 more families signed by early October. One of them, the Halpins, left without saying goodbye. Then one morning, a 4th man arrived, not in fine boots or pressed wool, not with a smile. He came with a badge, a federal surveyor, deputized to enforce property claims. He wore a revolver on his hip and a rolled warrant in his coat, and he walked straight to Ezra's cabin with the others at his side. "You're in violation," he said. "Unregistered settlement on federal mining land. You've refused survey. You've interfered with licensed development. You need to vacate." Ezra said nothing. The man handed him the paper. "You have 10 days, he said. They turned and left. That night, the valley held another council. This time, the voices were angrier, louder. Men argued, women wept, some shouted for resistance, others begged for peace. Ezra listened, then stood. "They will not wait 10 days, he said quietly. "They will try to force it sooner, with fire or force." "What do we do?" someone asked. Ezra looked to the hills, to the willow stands, to the stream and the gardens and the curved homes that had survived everything nature had thrown at them. "We stand," he said, but standing alone was not survival, and the storm coming wasn't one of weather. It was of men. The 10 days they were promised turned out to be a lie. The threat came on the 3rd. It was just before dawn when the settlers heard the rumble, wagon wheels, multiple sets, heavy and grinding against the hard earth of the high road. Dogs barked, then fell silent. Windows lit with the glow of oil lamps. Mothers gathered their children. Fathers reached for axes and rust-flecked rifles they hadn't touched since the first snow of the previous year. Ezra had been up before the noise. He always was. He heard the wheels and stepped outside his cabin with a blanket over his shoulders, watching from the ridge. 4 wagons, 24 men, not soldiers but armed. They wore rough coats, wide-brimmed hats, and a uniform kind of cruelty in their eyes. Men who'd been paid for work. Without conscience, they didn't wear badges, they didn't carry warrants, they carried crowbars and rifles and oil. One of them had a long torch already dipped in pitch. Ezra's heart didn't race, it went still. The settlement had seen weather, it had seen fire and flood. But what approached now was something colder, something more calculated. It was destruction with paperwork behind it. By the time the wagons reached the edge of the lower meadow, the settlers had gathered. Not all of them. Some still clung to their beds in denial, hoping this would pass like the rest. but enough to form a line. 20 souls, tired and soot-streaked, standing shoulder to shoulder. Most carried tools. A few held muskets, more for show than defense. Beckett stood near the front, Margaret beside him with her cane planted in the dirt like a flag. The man with the torch dismounted first. He didn't shout. He simply lit the end and held it high. Behind him, one of the company men, Trask, stepped forward. No smile this time, just cold legal authority behind his eyes. "You've been told," he said. "This land is claimed. Your structures are unauthorized. Your presence is trespass." Ezra stepped out from the line. Not forward, not aggressive, just enough so every man could see his face clearly. "We buried children here," he said, voice quiet but steady. "We survived the flood and the fire. We rebuilt what was lost. There's more life in these homes than in any paper you carry." Trask didn't blink. "You were warned." A few of the settlers began to murmur, but Ezra raised one hand and the group quieted. "I warned you," he said to Trask. "This land is alive. It remembers everything, and it does not yield to men who do not know its shape." Trask motioned to his men. "Clear them." It started with a shove. One of the company men pushed a young settler aside, a boy barely 17 who had lost both his brothers the year before in the fire. He stumbled, but did not fall. Then came the crowbars, used not yet on people, but on the nearest cabin, the one the Anders family had just finished rebuilding 3 weeks prior. They pried at the frame, shouting for anyone inside to come out. A torch touched the edge of the bark roof. The flame caught slowly, but it caught. Screams rang out, not of pain, but protest. The settlers surged forward, some grabbing at the men, others forming a line between the flames and the remaining homes. There was pushing, shouting. A single shot fired into the air as a warning. Chaos swelled like a wave. Then a second cabin went up. Ezra didn't run toward the flame. He ran toward the ridge, up the slope toward his own home, because he knew what came next. They wouldn't stop with two. They had come for everything. His home, the first, the strange, the sturdy, was the symbol of resistance. It would be the next target. He reached the front door just as the third wagon came to a stop 40 yards downhill. A man with a canister of lamp oil jumped from the rear and began unscrewing the cap. Ezra stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was dark, still, cool, despite the rising heat outside. Margaret had already taken shelter there, along with the Moore children and their father, a quiet man who had once tried to leave and now stood shaking with a hammer clutched in his calloused hand. Ezra didn't speak. He reached under the floorboards and retrieved the second bundle he had prepared months ago. Oilskins, wet hides, clay pots filled with ash and damp earth. They began sealing the cabin. The settlers outside did not scatter. They didn't run. They pushed back, not with force, but with presence. They blocked paths. They formed barriers. Beckett stepped in front of a man swinging a crowbar and said simply, "No." But Trask had come too far. He pointed to Ezra's cabin. "Take that one." The man with the oil canister nodded and began the climb. He didn't get halfway. A crack rang out, loud, sharp, unmistakable. The oil canister dropped. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Everyone froze. The sound had come from the tree line above, from the ridge beyond the creek. Ezra stepped out from his cabin's rear door, not alone. Behind him stood 3 men, mountain men, older, harder, dressed in leather and fur, and carrying long rifles that looked hand-forged and used. One of them had a hawk feather braided into his beard. Another wore a necklace of bone. They said nothing. They just raised their weapons. Ezra turned to Trask. "This land has watchers," he said. "You thought us few. You were wrong." Trask looked at the wounded man, then at the guns, then at the settlers still standing in a line, bloodied but unmoved. He cursed. Then he turned, and so did the rest. The wagons rolled back out by sunset. The cabins still burned behind them, but the others were untouched. The valley did not cheer. There was no celebration, only silence, and the slow, quiet return to rebuilding again. But this time it was different. The company would not return, not for now, because word spread that the valley had resisted, that the homes they called Childish had outlasted not just nature, but men, that something lived in the curved bones of that land that would not bow. The settlers became stewards. Ezra became something else, part man, part myth. They began calling his cabin by a new name, not Basket House, not Stone Eye. They called it the last house standing, because it had been, and because it always would be. But Ezra knew better. The land could still test them, still break them. And so the real question was not if they could survive, but whether their children would remember how. The years passed quietly after the stand. Not quickly. No, the seasons still crawled in their old rhythms, but quietly. The men from the company never came back. Their papers and threats and coin promises faded into rumor, and then into memory. No more wagons, arrived bearing contracts. No more maps were spread across crude tables. For a time, the valley was left alone. Ezra never spoke much of that day. When asked, he only said, "We stood when standing mattered." Then he would return to whatever task was at hand, digging a drainage ditch behind the Anders' new cookhouse, checking the clay sealant on the Halpen root cellar, or teaching a child how to read cloud shadows to know when to gather the tools and head inside. The settlement rebuilt, not all at once, not in grandeur, but in a slow, enduring way. It spread differently this time. The homes weren't placed along neat rows or clustered in convenient proximity to the river. They curled with the land's spine, built on rises and protected hollows. They weren't just structures, they were responses, each house a question answered. How do we live where wind talks? How do we keep warmth when water vanishes? How do we endure what changes without warning? Children grew up in those houses. Children who didn't know square corners or peaked roofs. Children who didn't call Ezra strange, but called him teacher, neighbor, sometimes grandfather, though he'd never sired children of his own. Margaret passed first during the winter of 46. She died in her sleep, wrapped in a heavy quilt in the cabin Ezra had helped her rebuild 3 times. The valley buried her beside her son, on the hillside, under a white pine. They carved no headstone, just set 3 stones in a ring around the grave and let the grass grow over. Ezra sat there most mornings that spring, drinking pine tea and listening to the wind in the needles. Beckett lasted longer than most expected. Age and guilt made him softer. He taught woodwork to the young, built tools for the infirm. In the end, it was a failing heart that took him. Ezra built his coffin from fire-dried spruce, sealed with wax and lined with wool. It fit him exactly. They buried him on the ridge he once mocked, beneath the very willow stand that had been Ezra's first source of materials. By the time Ezra reached 60, the valley had changed again, not in size, but in knowledge. Other settlers had begun arriving, not from eastern towns, but from broken places where nature had proven stronger than tradition. Men and women who had heard stories, not of gold or pasture, but of shelter, of a place where homes breathed, where people lived not on the land, but with it. They brought with them tools, livestock, questions. They came not to impose, but to learn. Ezra did not welcome them with sermons. He handed them spades, showed them how to feel for frostline under the soil, how to curve a roof to the morning light, how to layer bark and clay so that flames slid off it like rain. One of those newcomers was a man named Leon, tall, wiry, with a limp from an old cavalry wound, and eyes that never quite settled. He came from Arkansas, where floods had taken his farm and 3 of his children. He didn't believe in much anymore, but he watched Ezra build a shelter from river reed and earth, and then sleep inside it through the winter without once coughing from smoke or cold. And Leon said, "This is different." Ezra nodded. "It's honest." That word spread, honest. They began calling the building style honest housing, not in mockery, not to romanticize, but because it required humility. It didn't pretend to master nature. It admitted the builder was only a guest here. That word traveled farther than any wagon could carry it. By the time Ezra turned 70, people came not just from neighboring valleys, but from beyond the territory. They asked for guidance. They brought journals, sketches, hopes. Some called it earth sheltering, others low-form architecture. Ezra didn't call it anything. He just kept building. Then one day, Ezra did not rise. It was spring, early, with frost still clinging to the north slopes. A boy named Caleb, no older than 8, found him seated near the door of his cabin, back against the wall, eyes closed. The fire had burned to coals, tea still warm in the kettle. He had passed like the wind, quiet, unannounced, and leaving the air forever different. They did not bury Ezra in the valley. They built a mound, not of earth, but of memory. Each family brought something, a piece of their own cabin's foundation, a plank, a stone, a length of bark, a tool they'd made by hand. They layered it atop one another, not in grief, but in reverence. At the top, they placed a curved willow branch, shaped like the arc of his first roof. No plaque, no name, because his name had become the land. For a time, the valley was forgotten. The railroad passed it by, veering east for easier grade. The mines never came. The company never returned. But the homes remained. Even as decades rolled on, and the territories became states, and the West turned from wild to paved, those structures endured. They weathered storms no blueprint could predict, fires that licked at their edges but never found grip, floods that scoured the lowlands but left those curved walls untouched. And slowly, historians began to ask questions. They found records in Cheyenne of a non-compliant valley, letters referencing primitive dwellings that resisted both regulation and acquisition. Sketches of circular homes made of bark and clay that had withstood floods better than stone. They followed those threads. They visited, and they saw the last standing homes, not grand, not symmetrical, but alive. In the late 1890s, an architect named Helen Brewster published an article in a Denver paper titled "The Valley That Bent with the Wind." She described the strange homes that curved with the hills and stayed cool in summer, warm in winter. She spoke of Ezra Dalton, not as a builder, but as a listener, a man who had taught by doing, who had watched the world break around him and decided not to fight it, but to understand it. The article spread, and in time, the idea seeded something deeper. In 1924, when an architect named Richard Moline was commissioned to design housing for settlers in the drought-stricken regions of Arizona, he cited Ezra's techniques directly. In 1938, during the height of the Dust Bowl, federal relief housing borrowed from earth-breath structures, half-subterranean homes built with curved sod roofs and small openings, insulating against the cruel sweep of wind. Even today, in hidden corners of architecture journals, in studies of indigenous-informed design, in sustainable building manuals passed between back-to-the-land communities and wilderness schools, there are references, sometimes just footnotes, sometimes more. Basket form earthen home, design traced to 19th century valley in Wyoming territory, built by settler of Cherokee descent. They never show his face. There are no portraits, but they draw his roofline with precision. And somewhere on a hill, in a forgotten bend of land, untouched by the roar of modern roads, a rounded structure still stands, moss-covered, bark-layered, clay cracked but strong. Birds nest in its eaves, wind bends around it, not against it. And sometimes, when the sky turns gold just before rain, you can hear something in the wind. Not words, not names, just the memory of something that was built to listen and endured.